Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for Learning Through Adjacencies, the West Island LGBTQ2 Plus Center. Today, we are going to be speaking with David, and I would like to turn the floor over to him right now. Thank you so much, David.
Well, thank you for having me. I guess good afternoon to start with. My name is David Hawkins. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the executive director at the West Island LGBTQ2 Plus Center. So today I really wanted to talk about a couple components of the work that we do. And I really wanted to try and take it through a kind of a linear timeline since the inception of the organization to kind of where we are today. I reached out to the EDGEy network at the beginning of the year to really talk about sharing our story because over the past couple of years, we've seen some really amazing growth at the organization, specifically as it relates to our work with the trans community and transgender communities in the West Island of Montreal. So I guess the first thing I wanted to start with was just a little recap of who we are as an organization. So the West Island LGBTQ2 Plus Center was created in 2011. We were really created with the express interest of providing resources to a community that, aside from us, did not have any previous LGBTQ2 plus specific resources. So we were created originally as an outreach ministry of the Beaconsfield United Church. The center was kind of the brainchild of a couple of their lead administrators as well as their congregation. And really was designed in the beginning as a place where LGBTQ teens could really come and express themselves freely and find support within the community. Now, the reality was that where we are located, we are outside of the city of Montreal, and we kind of exist in the suburbs to the west of the city. And so anybody who's looking for inclusive LGBTQ2 plus specific resources would have had to have traveled into the city proper. And especially when we talk about teens and young adults, that isn't always something that was feasible, considering public transport could take up to 2 hours or 3 hours, depending on where you were coming from. So our center was really created as a space where teens could access something that was more local and tailored for them, and really allow them to express themselves authentically as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer people. Now, over time, we recognized that it was not just a youth population that needed these services. It was something that was really beneficial to the wider community, and people were really invested in the work that we were doing. So while it started with a youth drop-in in 2011, within a year, we started thinking about ways of adding new programs and projects into the body of work that we were doing. So in 2013, we created a support group for friends and family. And that was really just designed to provide resources, services, and support for parents who were coming to terms with their children who are coming out as gay or trans or lesbian or what have you. And so that program was launched as a result of a couple parents discussing the need that they experienced and that they were not able to access resources for because none really existed within the region. Shortly after that, we ended up looking at how to incorporate isolated LGBTQ seniors. So one of the realities that we face, and that specifically gay and lesbian and trans seniors face today, is that they experience a greater deal of isolation. And similarly to youth, there were no resources available west of Montreal. And even in Montreal, there were only really a couple organizations that were doing that work at the time. And so we created our West Island Rainbow Seniors originally as a separate entity to run specifically senior-based and LGBTQ-based resources and programming. Now, it was around that time that we as an organization realized that operating as two independent bodies didn't necessarily work. It put a lot more barriers in place than it diminished. It made it a lot harder to function, and we realized that there was a lot of stuff that was being duplicated unnecessarily. So at the time, we had a board of directors for our youth organization, and we had a board of directors for our seniors organization. They had separate business numbers, separate charity numbers. But aside from that, a lot of the work that we did for each group independently overlapped with each other. And so it was around that time that we started looking at ways of merging the two organizations just to decrease some of those redundancies and allow us to continue working towards our goal of providing these essential resources to the LGBTQ community. In about 2016, it was around that time that we then started looking at our next set of programs and projects. So the first program that we looked at was the creation of a young adult program. Now that it had been roughly 5 years that the youth drop-in had been running, we started to see a phenomenon where some of our youth continued to need or want access to our resources, but were aging out of the youth category, and they were kind of entering into a void of non-existing resources. So it was through that realization that the center then created our young adult programming. And so that program was created again to fill a very specific niche for people ages 18 to 30, where they could also express themselves authentically and kind of come together and meet other people who were also learning how to balance the responsibilities of being adults, who were aging out of the youth programming, and who are also learning to understand themselves and their community in terms of or through an LGBTQ lens. After that, in 2018, we then worked on creating our next program, which was our transgender support group. And so that group was a really interesting endeavor for us because it highlighted something that we had been noticing now at that point for 2 or 3 years, was that more and more across all of our programs, we were seeing an increased rate of people who were identifying as transgender. So whether they identified as trans men, trans women, male to female or female to male, whether they identified as non-binary or gender fluid or gender queer or something that was less binary, across the board, we did actually see the increase in terms of trans representation in all of our groups. And for us, one of the challenges that we were facing at that point was the fact that we couldn't, even though we had such a high predominance of trans people in some of our programs, we could not start customizing and tailoring the programs to the trans realities that they were experiencing, because we always had to take into account that there were going to be cisgender people in the room. And so it was at that point that we really focused on creating this transgender support group. And again, very similar issue to that all of our other programs had to address was the fact that there was no intergenerational trans support work being done in the West Island. And that was even something that was similar to seniors, not something that was being addressed by a whole lot of organizations within the greater Montreal area. And so that was, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the first time that we received funding from the EDGEy network and specifically from an innovation fund. And that was, I think, one of the pivotal moments in which we kind of realized that despite the fact that we were launching all these new programs, they had a lot of very similar ideas at heart. So they had oftentimes the same reasons for coming into existence, if slightly modified. The programs were taking on very similar approaches and taking on similar structures as each other. And that was something that was kind of universal across all of our programming or most of our programming. And it really highlighted the fact that there was always going to be more work to be done. There were always going to be new populations that needed to be serviced, or communities that were currently underserviced that would need access to services themselves, and that really were customized and tailored to their unique experiences. Now, since the creation of the Trans Support Group, another program that we've taken on is the creation of an independent organization in the region of Vaudreuil-Soulanges. So really everything that's west of the West Island and west of Montreal, but east of Ontario. So there's a region of about 27 municipalities off the island of Montreal to the west that, similar to the West Island in 2011, don't have LGBTQ2 plus specific resources. They do not have communities that are devoted to inclusive work within the queer community, or understanding and educating the community about those realities. And so then that was kind of the following project that we took on. And similar to everything else we had done at that point, it was we were looking to fill a niche or a void where resources did not exist. But something that was new for this compared to the previous programming was the fact that we were really working to create an independent organization and a completely independent entity with the full intention of allowing that organization to go forward and really take on the form that Vaudreuil-Soulanges needed. So taking into account things like the unique geographical um, aspects of the region. So the fact that it's a more rural region, slowly becoming more suburban, but still not quite at the point of being an urban region. It's also a region that is much more bilingual than the island of Montreal and Quebec as a whole. The West Island is predominantly English. Quebec is predominantly French, but Vaudreuil-Soulanges is much closer to the 50-50 level of having half the population that are Anglophone and half that are Francophone. And so working on the Vaudreuil-Soulanges program, which also receives some innovation funding, that's been a really interesting new project that we've had to take on in the past couple of years. And so the reason I wanted to talk about the history and the context was because it was important to understand those to kind of understand all the work that we are doing and what we really hope to accomplish. Now that I've talked about the history as a whole, I do want to hone in on a couple key points. So first and foremost, I want to talk about our experience with our transgender support group. So the creation of that group was really instrumental for us as an organization in terms of expanding and in terms of learning how to focus our resources more effectively to target communities in need. So unlike the youth drop-in and unlike the seniors group where it's kind of open to anyone who identifies as part of the community, this was a project that had to really focus in on the unique lived experiences of trans people. And so whether that means having conversations at the program that are much more unique to the trans community, or whether it's talking about supplying workshops and activities that would be of much more interest to the trans community, or really just whether it's working with trans people to help them find access to the services that they need that we ourselves do not provide. That really brought us into a new level of understanding in the way that we approach this work. Now, when I was preparing for this Edge Network conversation, and I spoke with Carla Leone, she had used a term that I found really interesting, and I've kind of adapted it because I think it really suited the work that we do. And the term is adjacency. So the idea that we take what is already existing, we start with one thing, we hone that idea, and then we take that idea and we adapt it to future needs. So as we identify additional communities that need service or additional spaces that we could fill a void, we adapt the template that already exists and we modify it to be able to cater it more specifically to those set populations. 10 years ago, when we launched this organization, I do not think that anybody really believed that we would be where we are today. I do not think that anybody at that time was talking about the importance of doing intergenerational transgender support work. That was something that came about years after the fact and really only came as a result of recognizing that there was a need and that need was not being addressed in any form, even within our own organization. It was important when we reached 2020 and we started talking about the idea of creating support programs for people who come from diverse backgrounds. So whether they are people who are Black or Indigenous, whether they are immigrants or refugees, we are seeing an increased need within our community. In just the past couple months, we've seen more refugees access our services than we had seen in the past 9 years previously. We as an organization recognize that we are very white and that is something that we need to change. And when we reached the year 2020 and we started to see the mass social movement around the Black Lives Matter movement, and when we saw the mass protests around the George Floyd murder, we recognized that we as an organization also had a lot of work to do. And so again, that comes back to an idea of adjacency of how do we adapt our existing programs and our existing templates to take into account the realities of people who are not currently fully supported by our programming. Can they access the programming? Yes. But do they necessarily feel that it's been tailored to them and that it takes into account their lived realities? Not necessarily. And so that's a place for us to grow in the future. We can take a lot of lessons away from our development of the transgender support group. It was a learning curve of a year where we said this was a pilot project we wanted to run. We recognized really quickly that, in fact, it could not just be a pilot project because immediately the need was there. We expected that the first month, the first 2 months, we would be getting by with a membership of 2 to 3 people a night who were interested in seeing where this project could go. But as of our first pilot project meeting for the trans support group, we were getting average attendances of over 10 people a night. And so that was a really interesting adjustment for us because we had to say, okay, clearly the need is there. The pilot project, even after one night, has been successful. And so how do we build that? How do we take this idea and how do we build off of it? What are the kind of workshops that we need to be offering? What are the kind of discussions we need to be fostering? How do we help link those vulnerable people who identify as trans to services that will accommodate and respect them in their gender identity? And so now a lot of those lessons that we took from the trans support group and the creation of the trans support group are things that we can use in our next endeavor. So working with the Vaudreuil-Soulanges region to create an independent organization that really takes into account the unique needs of the region. Whether it's the creation of a BIPOC support group or a support group for immigrants and refugees, how do we customize that to meet the needs of that unique population? How do we take some of those important conversations that we need to have as queer people, but also how do we take some of those unique conversations that need to be had as people living in a very vulnerable minority context, and how do we incorporate those into the programming that we're going to offer? So as an organization, we have spent 10 years now really working on creating these programmings and filling existing voids within the region. It started with a youth program, and that youth program quickly identified future and other needs. So supporting parents, or that seniors who were part of the community also were experiencing extreme isolation. That is directly what led us into the creation of a trans support group and doing intergenerational trans support work. And from there, that is where we recognize that we as an organization, part of the reality of what we hope to accomplish is that we want to be able to service communities that do not have previous existing resources. We want to be able to offer those services to people and take into account all of who they are, not just one facet of who they are. So we've had 10 years of growth. Every year we see more demand for what we're doing. We see new ways in people are requesting our services. And we fully expect that we can keep developing at this rate in the next coming 10 years. But that requires knowing our community, understanding our community, and learning how to customize our resources to support them in their unique challenges. And so that's about all I've got for today. But I really want to say thank you again to the EDGEy Network. I want to say thank you to Carla Leone just for the opportunity to be able to do this. I think it's a really important conversation, and I hope that everybody who gets to watch this video gets to take away at least something from what we've been able to talk about today. So thank you.
Thank you so much for everything that you do, David.